right, dear ones, good to see you this evening. Appreciate you being here. Your attention to this class. We're in the Padfield book, David Padfield's book, on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And tonight brings us to the second lesson, although he doesn't number his lessons. I've numbered them, but he doesn't. This is page 3 in his booklet, and it's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So about half of chapter 2 we're going to try to cover tonight. So one of the earliest books written in the New Testament. I was trying to see why this isn't working. It started the other night not working either. Let me just check. But Paul's second preaching trip, he established a church in Thessalonica, however I pronounce it differently each time. But if you notice, that was Acts 17. If you go back to Acts 16, we're in Philippi. And Philippi, just a little bit to the east of where the arrow point is, Thessalonica, there'll be some comments about that and what happened there in tonight's lesson. So that's what we're working on. What do we learn from Thessalonians chapter 1? What do we learn in the last lesson? Paul and his companions, did you say? We talked about who they were. Mm-hmm. Let's see, what else did we get in that? We're chosen by God. The gospel came to Thessalonica. They imitated Paul, even though they experienced great affliction. And they had a reputation, a good reputation. It's already gone out. People in the then world had heard about how they were obeying the gospel. And he said it was so amazing when he went somewhere, he didn't have to explain the church in Thessalonica. It's like, oh, we've heard of those guys. Yeah, they're doing really well. So they had a reputation. And we covered all that in 1 Thessalonians. As we go to 2nd chapter, and this is the first half of the 2nd chapter tonight, Paul's going to reflect upon his preaching when he was there, but really going to stress his conduct while he was there. So we're talking about not so much what he said, but what he was doing, how he was living his life. And so that's a part of the gospel, or the authenticity of the gospel is the character of the preacher. That's at least how he connects them in this chapter.
I think
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great chapter, and it really, I don't know, it's a lesson to anybody who would be an evangelist, lesson to me and anyone else that would preach about the connection between the message, getting the message right, and getting the character right. Somebody said one time, we could have a lot more preachers if you didn't have to live it. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess you could, but I don't know how effective they'd be if they were, yeah, anyway. All right, so he says, starting off, you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, about our coming to you. It has not proven to be purposeless. In the English Standard, for you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. By the way, this brings up a point. When I read that translation, the translation that's in the column of the book, did you recognize that translation? If you go back to the cover page on his booklet, the one with a picture of the White Tower, way down in the fine print, it says that scriptures quoted by permission, all scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are from the New English Translation. So that's a translation we don't use very often. But it's the one Padfield built the quotation, the lesson around. So if it falls a little differently on your ear, that's because it's a translation we don't use very frequently. So he says in verse 2, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal, our exhortation, does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. So, what exactly happened to him in Philippi? Do you recall? Acts chapter 16. That happened, that was the way he was mistreated. The first thing that happened in Philippi wasn't mistreatment. That was where he went down by the river to pray, and Lydia was there, and Lydia's household and she are converted, and that's a good thing. And then there was a girl there who had some sort of a familiar spirit annoying them, and he just cast out the familiar spirit. So that's when her handlers, if you will, thought she was broken, and they were the guys that broke her, so they decided to throw him in prison and beat him first. So all that happened, and they were in prison. That was the instance where the Philippian jailer is saved. After there was an earthquake, the cell doors opened, and he thought his prisoners were gone, he was going to kill himself, and Paul got his attention. All the prisoners were there. He was greatly relieved, and he asks, what must I do to be saved? One of the 3 times in the Gospels or in the book of Acts that we see that question asked and answered. He's told he needs to believe, and then he's taught, and then he and his household obey. And then they bring to the attention of the folks that have thrown him into prison the character of these people, and they did get an apology for being beaten and thrown into prison. And then they were given their rights back, and then they were able to go again on the preaching trip. So when he says, if we had suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, that latter part of Acts chapter 16 is what he's referring to there. Okay? So, I wanted to point out to you here how many times he says this. Look in yellow up here. You yourselves know. And then in verse 2, as you know. And then in verse 5, as you know. So Peter talks about stirring up their minds by way of remembrance. He's not giving them anything new, but he's drawing their attention to something they already knew. And that was that in the first verse, it wasn't in vain. Things happened. People believed this gospel. People responded. It was great. But they were bold in speaking the gospel in verse 2, as they knew. But they didn't come with bad motives, flattering speech, as you know. So Paul calls the Thessalonians to witness. You know what I was like when I was there. But it isn't just the Thessalonians that he calls to witness. Look at this. God is witness. He's calling God to witness the things that he had been doing and the way he'd been doing them when he was there. So, wonderful thing to be able to refer to people that have seen you and say, well, you know how I was. And then ultimately to say, God knows how I was. That's how he does that.
That shows you what kind of person he was. I mean, those people knew that he'd been the one that persecuted them earlier on. Now he's telling a totally opposite story.
Yeah.
And that he has the courage to do that.
Yes.
You know, and
Yeah.
he knows that they're going to say, well, this guy, you know, we know him from before.
Yeah.
And it's going to be hard to listen to him, but, you know, that didn't deter him.
No, he was 100 miles an hour, whichever way he was going. When he was persecuting more so than anybody else. And now that he's preaching more so than anybody else. As he goes on to list the things that he was doing and was not doing when he was there, he was in the negative in verse 5. We didn't come with flattering words or pretext for greed, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. Hey, you've got to provide for us while we're here speaking to you. That's just the way this works. He didn't do that. Now look at beginning in verse 7 at the descriptions of his conduct among them. In verse 7, we prove to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Besides, that's the translation that I'm working from here. I think it might be the New American Standard. In the English Standard, in verse 7, we were gentle among you, but look in the New English translation. Instead, although we could have imposed our weight as apostles of Christ, instead we became like children among you. Isn't that interesting? Instead of saying gentle among you, we became like children among you. There are 3 times in this section where he refers to the family, and he said he was like some element of the family. This first one here, being gentle, is like a child. The second part, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Is that not a beautiful description of how to provide for someone and how to care for them intimately and tenderly? And he goes on in verse 8, having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives. I don't know if you ever thought of that, but whenever anybody's speaking to you, preaching the gospel to you, he's using up some of his life to do that. He's not somewhere else doing something else. You know, he's imparting his life to you in a way. And that's what he's saying. We are well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel, but also our own lives, because you had become very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night as day so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You're witnesses, and so is God. How devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behaved toward you believers. Look at this contrast now. If you pull all that he's been saying in these verses out, you get a list of things he was not doing and a list of things he was doing. He didn't come in deceit. He wasn't there to trick anybody. He didn't come there because he was being mean to anybody, and I think that's what guile would be translated as. It wasn't about uncleanness. He wasn't trying to get some greedy thing that he wasn't supposed to have. He wasn't trying to get men to be pleased. He wasn't doing this to get a following for himself. He wasn't flattering. What's the difference between flattery and edification?
And what?
Edification. You ever edify someone?
Building somebody up.
Yeah, edify is,
Is like being insincere.
just let me give you one word and it'll click it right in. Edify is build up. Flattery is to puff up. Just puff them up. If I said, Hamer, you're such a good singer. You always tell me how that's just flattery. That's just flattery there, That's not, there's not built on anything. But, you're a good encourager. That would be edifying and that would be true. But
Well, by the same token, if you told him that, he's very well versed in the gospel and so on, then that would be both. That would be flattery as well.
yeah. Puff them up, but build them up as well. Maybe you can do both at the same time. But he says he wasn't there just to flatter somebody, And you can do that. You could say things people like to hear, and you can get some sort of an inroad with them, I guess, or effect with them.
And you almost have to have an approach like this. If you have an approach where you're angry and critical and so on, and we know, you and I both know a preacher like that at one time.
Uh-huh.
And you're not gonna win any souls
It's,
like that.
it's,
By always being critical and
Yeah.
mean and so on to people.
yeah. I mean, it is, and it's such a balance. I was reading about this past week. It's not a new idea, but it's hard to get people to appreciate how wonderful forgiveness is. The forgiveness that is in Christ really is, until you help them see how terrible their condition was while they were in sin. So you almost have to accentuate the sin and really focus on that and say how bad it was before they can appreciate how good the forgiveness is. So the balance in that, you don't want to just be talking about the sin all the time, and you don't want to be just talking about forgiveness all the time. Can you do both? Can you keep it balanced? Covetousness is desiring people's stuff. I'll preach for them so they give me their stuff. Disorder, just kind of stir things up because it's more exciting when everybody's infighting, something like that. Yikes. Or freeloading, just kind of getting taken care of. So he says, when I came to you, it wasn't in any of that. What did he come in? Well, he came in devotion. He's devoted to the individuals he was preaching to and to the gospel and to the God who sent him. Justice, doing things right, doing things the way they ought to be done. Gentleness, as opposite to men pleasing, God pleasing. He was doing what God wanted him to do. In terms of sin, personal sin, blameless. Blamelessness, meaning, you could throw some mud at him, but it wouldn't stick. He wasn't doing anything publicly that was wrong that anybody could call him out. And he was working hard to support himself. So that's, once you read that section, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, you could pull these out and see what he didn't do, what he did do, and it's an interesting contrast.
How do you explain verse 7 there?
Which,
He said, we could have imposed our weight at the gospel of Christ. That wouldn't win anybody over.
well, I think when he's talking about that, he could have talked about the authority that he had, because he was appointed by God to do this, more of a heavy hand, you have to do this. Or he could have been talking about support, and you have to pay me while I'm here, or I won't preach, that kind of thing. And he said he didn't do that. He didn't impose on them in any way. He realized they were kind of fragile, just getting started, and so it's persuading them, not forcing them, and not requiring of them anything financial.
Well, another place, he did say he worked,
Yeah,
and so it wouldn't be a burden to anybody.
and it says it here too. This is what he's doing here. Right here, verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We were working night and day, so we might not be a burden to anybody. Okay? And in 1 Thessalonians 2:8, having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you'd become very dear to us. And so, maybe not as emotional and tender as the 2 Corinthian letter, but this 1 Thessalonian letter has some tenderness in it too. I was like a child. I was like a nursing mother. I was like, as you're going to see as we go on, he's like a father, a good father too. And here's that part. In verse 11, just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children. So it's really beautiful, I think, to see how God's creation and a right operation of this world points to righteousness. What do I mean? Light is a wonderful thing. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Blood is amazing. It's where the life is. Jesus gave his blood. Everybody knows what a door is. Jesus says, I'm the door. Let's see, what else did he say? Bread. Bread is something we all partake in, unless you're on the Atkins diet. I saw a cookbook a few years ago. Atkins is dead, please pass the bread. But everybody has bread, and Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. So many fundamental things. Water is so necessary. If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. Out of him shall flow, living springs. And so these basic things of life point to Jesus in a wonderful way. And these basic things in a family, a good working family, point to how Paul was with them. I was like a child. I was like your nursing mother. I was like a good father. It's so great to be able to point to those basic things and say, that's what I was like when I was with you. And then verse 12, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom in glory. So that's as far as we're going to go in terms of the text. Let's see if we can get to the questions. We already answered question number 1. What happened to Paul at Philippi? Treated spitefully, beaten, thrown into prison. Later apologized to, but damage had been done. How did getting treated so poorly in Philippi affect his preaching in Thessalonica? Did he hold back and cower? That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. In verse 2, we'd already suffered and been shamefully treated, but we were still preaching with boldness, and we were still declaring to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So there were still a lot of people giving him a hard time, but he did not scale back. He did not cower. Same way we're studying, Joshua in Sunday mornings, be strong and of good courage. Paul was strong and of good courage in what he was doing. Amazing example of that. Question number 3, what was Paul entrusted with, and when did he receive that? He was entrusted with the gospel. Yep, it's somewhere in there. Maybe when Jesus tapped him, he was entrusted, or maybe when Ananias came to him, or when Ananias explained what he was going to do. Somewhere in there, he realized he had a mission, and that was to go to the Gentiles. He was entrusted with it. Number 4, what did Paul deny using at Thessalonica?
Flattering speech.
No flattery. No flattery. It's a shortcut. It's a tactic, I guess you could say, a way to get in a relationship quickly, perhaps, to flatter someone. And I guess it only works with folks who aren't being too careful in what they're listening to. You know, you've got to fall for it when you're being flattered, and I guess it works sometimes. But he denied using flattering speech. Anything else that he denied? Greed. It wasn't about greed or glory, trying to get following. That wasn't it. Number 5, how did Paul treat the saints in Thessalonica? These familial examples. Yeah, sharing the gospel, sharing his life as a nursing mother, as a good father. That's what he was like, a good father, a good mother. And it's, I don't know in what sense he would have been like a child among them, but he said like a child too, so. Okay, yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the way.
Another thing, when a person brings up down as a child, you bring this up to the, because they, should, the time he goes up to the level, so he don't think he's above, you said earlier, he has the power, the authority to provide, and act, show him that you have to do this. He goes to their level, so they didn't see him as a high figure, but a person just has been teaching them what it means to know.
Not lording it over, not using personal authority. I don't know if he had any personal authority, but he wasn't using that personal authority. Number 6, question 6, what did Paul impart to those at Thessalonica? He imparted the gospel, and he imparted some of his life to them as well. You know, share both, his gospel and his life. And then, number 7, his manner of life while he was at Thessalonica. He worked. He supported himself while he was there. You know, he didn't do that always, but he did it here in Thessalonica. He felt like that would be the right thing to do. So, you know, is he working all day and preaching all night, or working most days and preaching some days? He just says he was working night and day, so he wouldn't be a burden to any of you. But then, that's part of it. What else was his manner of life? In verse 10. That's right, yeah. So, holy.
It's really important for somebody that's trying to teach.
Exactly. Holy, righteous, and blameless. Holiness set apart unto the Lord, living for him. Righteous, that's a religious word, a word that we use in religion a lot, righteous. Well, the righteous brothers, I guess, but then, you know, righteous and righteousness, it's just doing what is right. There's a right way to live. There's a right way to behave. And he was doing what was right. And then the last one, blameless. Blameless. And that's just another way to say that. I guess it's maybe the opposite of righteous, but, or another way to state righteousness. Not that you were just doing right, but that you weren't doing anything wrong. You're blameless if you're not doing anything wrong. So if you take that answer, you kind of got the answer to question 8, I think. What does it mean to live in a way worthy of God? Holy and righteous and blameless, those all work again. It's what he's calling everybody to do. And generally, when you get the qualifications of a preacher or a deacon or an elder or whomever, it's really just stuff saints ought to be doing, everybody ought to be doing. We're all called to the same standard, really, in terms of righteousness and holiness and blamelessness. And so he's walking the walk, not just talking the talk, and encouraging everybody else to do the same. And then a how question here. How did God call us to his own kingdom and his glory? Through his Son, through the Word.
Verse 12 said exhortation, encouragement, insistence.
That's right. Exhorted. What is an exhortation? Yeah, I think so. It's
Encourage.
An exhortation, I think, is part instruction. Like, here's what you ought to be doing, and then it's part, so do it. It's part of here's what to do, and then get on with it too. You're pushing in a direction with words. Do that thing. That's right. Do it. Take it up.
That's why I come up with encouragement there. I mean, you think of, the best example I can think of cheerleaders in some athletic event. They're out there, they're really cheering and yelling, they're screaming, jumping, and that's what they're doing. They're exhorting
Yeah.
the team.
Maybe they're the encouragement, and then the coach is the exhortation. He's like, all right, now here's what you're going to do. Here's your plan. Now get in there and do it. So that might be football might have explained that to us there. Now all I have to do is explain football, and we'll be in good shape. So God calls us to his kingdom and his glory. When you think of the glory of God, what do you think of? Events in the Bible that involve the glory of God? This is a good review.
I think it's a Hebrew would say something like that, Shekinah glory. The idea where the glory is more like a tangible manifestation of his being. I guess is the best way to articulate what that is.
Yeah. Where did people see the glory of God? Okay. Yeah, that's right. And so that was at that time on the mountain, right? It's on top of Mount Sinai. Before they got to Sinai, it was leading them, right? And it's at one point between them and the army that was pursuing them. So the glory of God led them to Sinai, dwelt on top of Sinai, made them afraid to go up there, and they were not called up there except Moses and Joshua part way. Then it led them in the wilderness for 40 years, and it led them, I don't know that it was visible when they crossed over the Jordan into the promised land, but where did it appear? I guess I could have backed up. At Sinai still, when the tabernacle was constructed, it came and dwelt over the most holy place, and then it led them. And whenever they set up the tabernacle, it dwelled over the most holy place. And you could look and you could say, God is with us. Look, he's right there over the most holy place. When they built the temple under Solomon, the glory came into the most holy place, such that the priests couldn't even minister in the temple because the glory of the God was in there. The glory of God was in there. The glory of God. Glory is another way to describe weight, I think, as well. I mean, it's normally associated with light, but it's if we glorify God, we realize how heavy he is. And I used to like, one of the good things that came out of the 60s was the people would say, oh, that's heavy. That's really heavy. You know? That's a good thing to say about God. He's really heavy. You know, he's really heavy. But yeah, when you glorify God, you're saying how heavy he is. All right, saddest day with respect to glory, Ezekiel chapters 9, 10, and 11, do you recall? The glory of the Lord departed from the temple. It came out of the most holy place. It came up to the doors of the temple. It came out of the temple. It went up to the edge of the town. It went up to the hillside, and it was just gone. God was saying, if you're going to act that way, I'm not going to be among you anymore. And when the glory of God departs from the temple, all that's left is for it to be destroyed. And that's what happened a few years later. And so then, you know, they build the temple for Zerubbabel's temple is built. And I don't think we read about the glory of God ever coming back to that temple. And so you're thinking, well, you know, where is the glory of God now? It's not in our temple. It's not here. What's going to happen? How's he going to follow this? Where's the glory going to appear? And then John chapter 1, the Word came and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father. So now the glory of God is in Jesus Christ. And you can't see it in the temple or the tabernacle, but you can see it in him. And then you see the glory. You know, he's taken up in glory, but then you can see the glory in a way in each of his saints now, in each member of the church, until he comes again in glory. So, interesting study about glory. God calls us to his own kingdom, but to his glory too. And so his holiness, his glory is a really important consideration. And when you're talking about sin is transgression of the law, John tells us, but Paul tells us it's falling short of the glory of God. You know, if you sin, you're just not as glorious as he is. And so when we're trying to be like him, in a way we're trying to attain to some way his glory. And so, just a little thought about glory as we looked at through chapter 2, verse 12. Anything else from verses 1 through 12 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But when you do things for people and you're not bringing it, people think it's just you really care about it.
Yeah.
So they gotta pay you, you know, if you don't normally come to the, you gotta pay me, you know, teach for this. They think about the money, not, you know, what you teach.
That's a good point, and maybe there's a corollary to that with respect to evangelism too. In our society where walls seem to be up most of the time, right? And guard is up most of the time. And, you know, there are folks on the street corners with their hands out, but are there places that we can really give and make a difference? Well, I guess what I'm getting at is if you have an opportunity to give something to a neighbor, maybe that's the time to sacrifice and to do that and to appear different and to, you know, differentiate yourself from the rest of the world. So, yeah. There's an old saying that says people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I don't know that that's exactly true, because it seems to me like you could just preach the gospel without any previous relationship and maybe it'll take root. But it's not a bad idea to show people how much you care before you bring the message. And I forget where I read it, but they say that it was taught by the rabbis at the time of Christ that if you didn't teach your child a trade, you taught him to be a thief. So that he was a tent maker, even though he was a scholar and, learned and studied with Gamaliel, and you might have just been a pure academician, he had something he could do to make a buck, and he did. He did it when he needed to. He turned it on as it needed to be turned on. So, all right. The way that the days of the month fall, next Wednesday will be our singing night, and it's kind of coming early in the month. But 2 weeks from tonight is when the next lesson number 3, will be. And I'll be gone then. I'll be gone that Sunday, 21st, and then the 24th as well. So, yeah. All right, thanks for ringing the buzzer, and we'll be dismissed till they come up from downstairs.